Good afternoon and welcome back to 28storms.com. This is your tropical weather update for Monday, October 3rd. We have a lot to discuss in the extended forecast. However, first off, we're still dealing with Tropical Storm Philippe out there in the central Atlantic. Maximum sustained winds are 65 miles per hour. It's moving off toward the west-southwest at 12 miles per hour, but we are expecting a rather sharp recurvature well to the northeast of Bermuda. Nearly all of the available model guidance is also in agreement with this idea of sharp recurvature, so we're really not all that concerned about Tropical Storm Philippe this afternoon. This afternoon's visible satellite animation shows that much of the tropics are rather quiet this afternoon. Here's Tropical Storm Philippe. It looks rather pathetic on satellite imagery. Much of the center is still exposed to the northwest due to a lot of wind shear. Over here in the western Caribbean, we do have a lot of isolated convection. You can see it even better on the infrared. However, on the latest water vapor, you can see that much of the basin is being dominated by quite a lot of strong winds, and the same can be said for portions of the Caribbean to the south of Cuba. Over here in the eastern Pacific, we still do not see any signs of organization, but several of the models are insisting that we will have tropical development out here within the next 4 to 5 days. This is the latest shear tendency map from the SIMS website, and this just shows that much of the Atlantic Basin is currently unfavorable for any type of tropical development. We see that there are very low winds here across Central America, but that upper level ridge is mainly centered over Honduras and Nicaragua, and of course due to a lot of land interaction, that's really not going to enhance the potential for development at all. But also pay attention to the south of Mexico. Upper level conditions are generally favorable. It's just going to take a few more days in all likelihood for a tropical disturbance to get its act together. But also, if we go ahead and switch back over to the Atlantic Basin, notice the sea surface temperatures are still more than adequate for a significant tropical development, especially in the western Caribbean to the south of Cuba. In fact, some of the highest oceanic heat content in the entire basin is still located between Cuba and Jamaica. This is the latest 850 millibar forecast from the 12Z run of the GFS model, and there are two main things to take note of. First off, it's keeping the eastern Pacific rather interesting with developing a tropical cyclone. By day 7, the tropical cyclone is still well to the west of the Mexican coast, but based on the overall pattern, the GFS is suggesting that it could make a turn back toward the northeast, which would make things interesting here along the Mexican Riviera. So we will be taking a very close watch at the eastern Pacific, especially in the extended range, but also here in the western portion of the Atlantic Basin, we see increasing low-level vorticity along both sides of the Florida Peninsula and extending southward into the western Caribbean. The 12Z run of the CMC model still appears to be too aggressive with developing tropical systems in the eastern Pacific, at least initially, but the bottom line is that by day 6, both the GFS and CMC are indicating the potential for one or more tropical cyclones, with the possibility of one of them impacting the Mexican coast. Also, the CMC is developing even more vorticity in the western Caribbean, especially to the south of Cuba. And if we switch over to the overnight 0Z run of the CMC for the extended 7 to 10 day forecast, we see that much of the eastern United States is being dominated by surface high pressure, and usually that is a good recipe for at least some type of tropical mischief, either in the northwest Caribbean or areas close to southern Florida. And sure enough, as we go into day 7 and especially day 8, notice the broad area of low pressure beginning to develop over the southwest Bahamas. It becomes even more prevalent by day 9, and by day 10, sure enough, we have at least a subtropical cyclone trying to make its way into the southeast Gulf of Mexico. The latest run of the ECMWF is continuing to show tropical mischief. The ECMWF has been the same model that has been showing this possibility all along. In fact, it was the first model to even show such a chance of this happening. And on the latest run, by day 5, sure enough, we already have indications of a broad area of low pressure beginning to develop just to the south of Miami, Florida. And the combination of a broad low to the south and a very strong surface high situated over Virginia is going to make for a very strong pressure gradient, and therefore as we go into next weekend we could have fairly gusty conditions across the entire state of Florida. And then as we go into day 6, we have increasing signs of low pressure here over the Florida Keys. By day 7, we have a potential subtropical storm here located just to the southwest of Tampa in Sarasota, Florida. By day 9, it's continuing to move north to northwest, and if this model were to verify, this could be a very rainy pattern for much of Florida and eventually up the eastern seaboard if this actually makes a track more toward the north as indicated. Next up is the latest surface analysis from the Hydrometeorological Prediction Center. I talked about this briefly yesterday, but as long as you have a stalled frontal boundary over the Northwest Caribbean or Southeast Gulf in mid-October, this usually sets the stage for tropical mischief, and sure enough, this frontal boundary could come into play here, especially in the extended range. In fact, many of the latest HPC and National Weather Service office discussions, especially stemming from the Florida offices, are alluding to the possibility of some type of tropical or subtropical development near southern Florida over the next 5 to 10 days. In fact, this is the latest 3-day forecast with the surface parameters overlaid here by the HPC. As we go into day 4, notice that the stalled boundary is still located over southern Cuba. However, by day 5, that trough is beginning to lift a little bit more toward the north, and now it has a 1012 millibar surface low associated with it. And notice the very strong area of surface high pressure here. That is going to make for a very windy event here over much of Florida. And as we go into day 6, that low is beginning to lift toward the north, and then by day 7, it's beginning to cross over southern Florida. If the low does eventually track into the eastern Gulf of Mexico and move rather slowly, this can make for a very rainy period across much of the state. However, the precipitation forecast is very problematic this far out. It all depends on how strong this low is going to get, if it develops at all, and then we must nail down the correct forecast track. But as of right now, the latest 4 to 5 day precipitation forecast from the HPC is indicating that much of the rainfall will occur over portions of the Bahamas. But it must be noted that in addition to all of the forecast uncertainties, this forecast is only for the next 5 days, so anything that is expected thereafter is not included within the current forecast. Last but not least, we've also mentioned that the Madden-Julian Oscillation has been unfavorable for tropical development in the Atlantic over the last couple of weeks. Much of the basin has been dominated by sinking air, as denoted by the brown lines across much of the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf of Mexico. But notice that we have a lot more lifting occurring over the western Pacific, and that is the positive phase of the Madden-Julian Oscillation working its way around the globe. And we've seen quite a lot of tropical activity surrounding the Philippines over the past week and a half, and there are indications that the positive phase of the MJO is going to spread over the western half of the Atlantic basin. And the models have been rather consistent on showing this. In fact, the latest GFS and its ensemble members are still forecasting the MJO to be into phase 8 as we go into the extended forecast period. And as mentioned in the last 2 videos, once the MJO goes into phases 8 and 1, that is usually when we see a slight uptick in activity, especially over the Gulf and Caribbean. So thanks again for using 28storms.com and the Hurricane Tracker app as a primary source for tropical weather information. We will continue to have more updates and videos throughout the remainder of the week, including the possibility of development near Florida and possibly in the eastern Pacific.